We will be starting in just 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Okay, good evening and good afternoon to everybody. We are in our fourth encounter meeting today, and we will be hosting Dr. Nicole Fox. This is the encounter series is organized by the Avraham Harman Research Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Institute of Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, directed by Professor Alon Confino, and I'm Amos Goldberg, the head of the Harman Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University. But before we start conversing with Nicole on her fascinating book, After Genocide, Memorialization in Rwanda, which came out in 2021, a few remarks. First of all, unfortunately, Alon cannot join us, or perhaps he's joining us as a listener and not as a converser, because he is now is going through chemotherapy because of he's got leukemia. So unfortunately, we wish him all. Unfortunately, he will not be discussing the book with us today. And we wish him a lot of love. And in Hebrew, we say refuah shlema, which would be, I would say, full recovery or speedy recovery. Alon, we miss you very much here. Now, a few housekeeping rules. The event is recorded and will be posted on YouTube in the Amherst Institute website. Now, you can, as we converse, you can ask your questions through the Q&A feature. The chat will be closed, so you can post your question as we speak or wait to the end, preferably as we speak, but you can also wait to the end of the conversation and then ask your questions. As we speak, links will be sent to the audience regarding the book and perhaps other information that will be mentioned. Our next encounter is on April 2023 with Adel Mana on his book Nakba and Survival, the story of Palestinians who remained in Haifa and the Galilee 1948-1956, came out 2022, and this is all in our series, this series which focuses on aftermath. But before we start conversing and introducing this fascinating book by Nicole, I cannot ignore the situation in Israel right now. As many of you know, we experienced a very dangerous time in Israel, very dire time. 2 weeks ago, a pogrom was conducted by Israeli Jews in the village of Hawara, and not only that officials did not condemn it, some applaud, among them senior ministers. Many in the current government insinuated in the past, or also not in the very long past, about a second Nakba, that is a second ethnic cleansing. As you all know, the very constitutional setting of this country is about to change. And this is really, really terrifying. We cannot even be assured that such a series as encounters with the topics that we discuss will be permitted after this revolution will take place. So I hope you are all aware of those events that shape in the Israeli society and country. So now I move to introducing Nicole. Nicole Fox is an assistant professor of criminal justice at California State University, Sacramento. Her research centers on how racial and ethnic contentions impacts communities with a focus on how remembrances of adversity shape social change and collective memory. Her most recent project examines individuals who conducted acts of rescue during episodes of mass violence, theorizing the social factors that shape such high-risk action. Her book that we will discuss now, 2021, After Genocide, Memory and Reconciliation in Rwanda, University of Wisconsin Press, focuses on how memorials to past atrocity impact community development and reconciliation for survivors of genocide and genocidal rape. She published a lot and she won a lot of prizes and fellowship. I just mentioned that her work has been supported by the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation and the National Science Foundation. So it is really great to have you here, Nicole. And we'll start with a very general question that we start with all participants. Can you briefly introduce your book, the main arguments, the main themes you touch in general for the audience that did not read it yet?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me here. So this book for me came out of a curiosity of just trying to better understand how memorials, especially memorials that are aimed at survivors of violence, how those have an impact in survivors' lives, how they matter. And so the broader question really of this book is, how do memorials matter to survivors of the genocide in Rwanda? And what I found is that they do matter, and they shape reconciliation, perspectives of reconciliation and forgiveness, that they can be sites of social networking, that they can be places where survivors feel validated and make connections, but that they can also be places of stratification, of where certain narratives are left out. And these aren't necessarily findings that are unique to Rwanda, but overall in terms of global efforts to commemorate violence.
You actually, your research, your fascinating book focuses on 3 memorials. Can you describe them before we go deeper into your analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to also understand variation among memorials in Rwanda, because for those who haven't been there, the memorial landscape, the physical built landscape of memory is quite extensive. So it's hard to go anywhere without seeing some kind of reminder of the genocide that occurred in 1994. So when I was doing my research, there was over 300 memorials, 7 national ones, and now I think it's well over 500. So what I wanted to study is look at 3 different of the national memorials and look at the variation and how variation in the physical landscape, the orientation, meaning what they focus on, and the survivors in that community, how that might impact the stories that are told and who feels included and who maybe feels marginalized. So the 3 memorials, one of them focuses a lot on commemoration. And what I mean by that is the memorial was really left in a lot of ways as it was found. So there was dried blood on the walls. There were clothes of those who had perished in that very area, and was really aimed at commemorating that past. And then there was another memorial that was still being developed, and that one was a lot more focused on the present, of reconciliation, of the bright future of Rwanda. And then the third memorial was really focused on education. So how the memorial could serve to educate new generations, the general public, but also, VIP diplomats and heads of state.
And were they all official memorials? And
yes, they were.
Where were they located?
So they were all located within 30 miles of one another, around the capital city of Kigali. And they were all funded and supported by at that time, there was a CNLG, which was an organization funded by the government that was running them, but also through the Ministry of Culture.
So now let's go to one of your, and here you can really elaborate, because this is on really the focus, one of the main focal points of your analysis. You talk about, and you also mentioned it, stratification of memory. So how does class impact memory, and what are the implications? Here, it's really, I mean, this was really for me very new and very interesting to see how, when you dive into it's not, just the official, when you dive into what really happens there, a whole new world comes up, and it's very different from our image, or perhaps even the intentions of so how class
Yeah.
is played out.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And just to go back a little bit, I want to explain what I mean by the stratification of collective memory. And what I mean by that in my book is processes in which certain narratives or certain stories of survival are elevated while others are marginalized. And that oftentimes those that are marginalized are by survivors who are already marginalized in the greater social order of society. And so what I found, and I think that this is also true across other cases, so that we sometimes think about this as a hierarchy of victimhood, right? That there are certain ideal victims, and we can think about this across various crimes as well, that there's certain ideal victims for certain crimes. But what I found in Rwanda is that there were certain stories that were really elevated when I went to commemorations. And commemorations are the events that are often held at memorials or during the mourning period to honor or remember the genocide. And oftentimes the central speakers were men, and men who had succeeded in genocide's aftermath, right? So they had a job, they had education, and they could really speak to overcoming it. And in a lot of ways, these were really important because they provided hope, they provided a way forward, they were inspirational, and they also didn't traumatize the audience in any way, right? So these were men that usually experienced physical harm. Sometimes they even lost a limb, but then they went on to be successful in this new Rwanda. But what you didn't often see is narratives of those who were not succeeding or not flourishing in genocide's aftermath. And class was one dimension of this. So for example, a lot of the women in particular, but a lot of survivors that I interviewed were still struggling and living in pretty extreme poverty. So for example, a lot of the women, their husbands who were murdered in the genocide were the key breadwinner. They were the ones that supported the family. So they no longer had this income. They were trying to raise their children on their own. They maybe didn't have skill sets right away. It was hard to become networked with other women because of the trauma that they experienced. And so those stories weren't necessarily highlighted. And so what I mean by that is that the stories about who succeeded were stratified, right? So those who had more resources and success were highlighted, and those who didn't have those weren't highlighted. The stratification also comes at another level in that these are already the poor individuals. And so when they don't see themselves reflected in these national narratives, it can actually further exacerbate their situation because they feel less inclined to engage in civic engagement or peace processes or social programs. And I just want to note real quickly that this stratification of collective memory also happens in terms of gender. And I don't think that's always that's unique to Rwanda, but we saw that as well in the Holocaust, that in the early years, the really famous survivors of the camps were men, and men who were able to articulate their experience.
Yeah, so it's actually what you say is those narratives, those unspoken narratives are not present in the public sphere. Can you give us an example of one of your interviewees that was such a non?
Absolutely, yeah. So, for example, there weren't a lot of public narratives of survivors of gender and sexual-based violence. And I want to preface this that in some ways wasn't always ill intent. That was oftentimes because those narratives did elicit a certain response in the audience that required some trauma care because it was created trauma responses. And that at the time I was writing my book, Rwanda just didn't have always the resources to care for that amount of people who were experiencing trauma. However, when I interviewed women who did experience that, they felt really left out because part of collective memory is making sure that people can see themselves in the narrative. It works because you can imagine yourself as part of the nation. You can imagine yourself as part of this larger collective memory that's supposed to bring unity and social bonding. But women who didn't see themselves reflected didn't experience those benefits of collective memory. And so a lot of them felt like their stories of survival were forgotten. And in a way, they kind of were, because it's really hard to have empathy or to provide care or allocate resources to a group of survivors you don't hear about. So if you're not hearing about the survivors of sexual and gender-based violence in these public spaces, the general public may be less aware of what their struggles are.
And how, so like you describe you elaborate on those traumatized and the way that they actually spoil the narrative. Can you describe it more in details? What those how do these actually events or memorial ceremonies take place, and what happens when someone is in trauma, and how do the other refer to it? Because this trauma is become a major concept in your research.
Yeah, so when I was in Rwanda, the trauma response of survivors and even their descendants who weren't even alive during the time of the genocide was actually increasing and peaking. And I interviewed with counselors and psychologists in Rwanda. What they really found is that actually, since there had been some time for people to rebuild their lives, it actually then allowed them time to reflect on what they experienced during those awful months in the spring of 1994, and actually bring back more memories that elicited a trauma response. And so one person actually said to me that remembering is a luxury, that after she rebuilt her life, then she was able to remember. But that when she was starving, when she was in a child-headed household, when she was trying to make ends meet, that was not a time that allowed her. And so that she ended up experiencing trauma later on when she had her first child. And I think that's rather common. So traumatizing is what it was described to me as, and it's a little bit awkward of a verb for those who English is your first language. You don't always talk about someone as traumatizing, but that's the way it was translated to me. And what this experience is when people experience flashbacks and of what happened to them in 1994, even imagined or real flashbacks. And it
In the
causes
ceremony itself,
in the ceremony itself. But also I have to say that those were the public places where that happens. But survivors told me that that actually happened at home as well. So especially on occasions where they wish that their family would have been there, their parents. So one said, at her wedding, she actually had a trauma response when she first gave birth. So these also happen in private, but they don't shape memory in the same way that they do when they happen in public.
So when they happen in public, what is the reaction?
Yeah, so when I was there would be someone who might be screaming and reliving what they experienced, and that would really be contagious in a lot of ways. And so that would spread across the groups. And so that person who was experiencing the trauma response would be taken out of the commemoration and given medical care. And at the time, they would take medical professionals would take the person experiencing the trauma response down to a tent, usually below the stadium or outside the area of commemoration, provide them with water, rest, and sometimes they would get better on their own. Some did need to be taken to hospitals, and at one commemoration I was at, the ambulances were getting quite full, that they needed to take people to a neighboring hospital. And it was a situation in which the commemoration had to be ended prematurely. And I think what this does is this shapes what narratives can be told because of the public health risk of having so many people experience trauma. Now, I believe since then, since my book's been written, trauma responses have decreased, but also they've done things to decrease such trauma. And that is to make sure there aren't strong testimony, violent testimony, they don't show images, things like that to try to minimize this trauma response and contagion.
Now, you mentioned it. Can you a little bit elaborate on the gender differences? And because as we all know, rape and gender-based violence, was very prevalent in the genocide. So does it have a space in those commemoration sites, in the ceremonies, in the testimonies? And you actually distinguish between some who give it more space and some who give it less space. So can you tell, how do they confront those memorial sites, and how do they confront sexual violence in the genocide and rape?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't mind, I'll back up a bit just to broaden it, in that, in every recorded war and genocide, we see the use of rape as a weapon. And so this was true in the Holocaust, Cambodia, Bosnia. We see this across the board. And so sexual and gender-based violence is a way to terrorize entire communities. And it isn't just women who are raped, but men, but very, very few men usually come forward. And I think that because it exists within these larger patriarchal societies and cultures of shame and silence, we see that reflected in commemorations. And this isn't true just for Rwanda, but also for Bosnia and even the Holocaust. We didn't really see discussions of gender and Holocaust memorials until the mid-90s. And there weren't really academic books written about gender in the Holocaust until the late 90s. And so this isn't something necessarily unique to Rwanda. We see this also in Bosnian memorials to the genocide as well, women being left out. Janet Jacobs' work talks about this quite a bit. But in Rwanda, what was unique is there was actually a memorial that broke this silence. And so in some ways, that oddity of a case was really interesting for me to study, to try to figure out, why did this memorial talk about gender and sexual-based violence and not others? And so I just want to give your listeners a trigger warning, because I will be talking about more specifics of gender and sexual-based violence. But the memorial that really discussed it at the most frequent rate, as I watched time and time again these guides give their tours, was a memorial that was aimed at commemoration. And this memorial had what they felt like were tools to depend on to share the story. And guides described this as they were simply doing their job of truth-telling. And so on the walls, there were weapons that were used to rape women. So they were able to talk about those weapons in very matter-of-fact ways. They were able to talk about the type of torture that was done on pregnant women because there was still blood on the walls. And so they used the physical space and the orientation of the memorial to commemoration to lend them the tools to talk about such a difficult topic. Now, another technique that I found in the education one was that they talked about it slightly more abstract by using physical and health terms. Like, for example, women experienced women got STDs and AIDS during the genocide. And then they'd often pause and wait for an audience member to say, well, how did they get AIDS? And then they would explain the rampant use of rape as a tool of genocide. Some would depend on talking about the 1994 International Court Tribunal for Rwanda, and mention the case where rape became a crime of genocide. But there were some, though, that didn't mention it. And I just want to briefly talk about this because I think this is true for a lot of places outside of Rwanda as well, but in particular for Rwanda, because what's unique about the genocide in Rwanda is that these were Rwandans killing Rwandans. So it wasn't an outside state or an outside country that was invading. It was Rwandans killing Rwandans. And in that way, this narrative of reconciliation or the ability to have social harmony sometime in the future is really important. And so the memorial that aimed to really show the viewer that reconciliation was possible, that Rwanda was going to the light, rather than the darkness of genocide, they were the ones that did not mention gender-based violence. And I assume that's because, as one guide told me, it's the hardest crime to forgive.
So, I mean, we already see the kinds of stories that do not have a place in the national narrative of reconciliation and hope and good future.
Right.
And one, as you said now, the gender-based or the sexual violence-based and rape are the most difficult to reconcile with the narrative of reconciliation. But how does that interact with at least the image that many people have of Rwanda as a very, very progressive in its policies towards women, that the women are part of the government, they have 50% of the government. I mean, all those very advanced or progressive policies, how does this come together with the idea that actually women's stories don't have a place in the national narrative?
Yeah, and it's not that women's stories don't have a place in the national narrative, because they most certainly do, in the sense of women taking on leadership role and entrepreneurship, and girls' education has skyrocketed since the genocide, and there has been some progress. It's that, in particular, gender-based violence and the aftermath of that still exists within a patriarchal society. So even when you have 50% of women in parliament, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're passing always gender-friendly laws or policy. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're also not existing within a patriarchal system that has difficulty talking about sexual violence. I mean, we think about how Rwanda is also trying to address, gender-based violence domestically. So it's not something that's just a challenge there. But also, even when you have women rising to the top, it doesn't always trickle down to women at the bottom. And so there's still a significant poverty experienced by a lot of widows, a lot of people in the rural area who are outside the Kigali region. And so, policies are put in place that may do quite a bit of benefit for urbanization and even gentrification, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all of those policies trickle down to women at the bottom. And it doesn't also mean that that means that women in positions of power don't do anything, right? So these are very complex situations in which the experience of women is not uniform.
Can you, for us to get a better understanding of what you actually talk about, can you explain or describe what really happens in those memorials? Like people come there every day, people come there, I mean, they interact on daily, they know each other. When are the testimonies presented? How does it go?
Yeah, that's a great question. So memorials also differ quite a bit. So let me tell you about one of them, and then I'll tell you about another one, and you can kind of see how they change. So one of them is across the street from a former child-headed household village. And what I mean by that is that children who were orphaned came together, and this was actually based on some of the work that was done in Israel after the Holocaust. And the children came together, and one became the head of the household, and they took care of the rest. And these homes were built, and across the way is a memorial where a lot of those children, well, they're now adults and have children of their own, but where a lot of their family is buried. And so at that memorial, there are some visitors that come. There are people who are from Western nations, from East Africa, and there's a good amount, and there's a handful of guides. But there's also a lot of people who go there and leave flowers for their family. There's survivors who work there who tend to the garden, and it's a immaculate. It's actually gorgeous. There's also where it's across the street from the sector headquarters too. So when people are discussing things that need to be changed in their community, they're right across from the memorial. So they might drop into that memorial and say hello to their loved ones, or plant a flower, or tend to the garden, or see how things are keeping up. And then a lot of people will meet there and walk to school together. And so it becomes kind of a social networking site as well, and a landmark in that community. Another one, the education one, is run, and there's schools coming in every day. There's heads of state. It's kind of what is called the VIP. Not all survivors I interviewed had been there, but it's gorgeous. It has a very linear and comprehensible narrative and pathway. It's like a museum as well as a memorial. And then the last one also gives tours, but that one has actually a site on it for survivor services, so legal services, counseling. And what's interesting about that is some of the counselors that I interviewed actually use that particular site as a technique in their counseling services. So for example, one person was so scared, a counselor, it's described about one of their clients that was so scared to go to a memorial. They were terrified, even though their family was at a memorial in the southern part of Rwanda. And so she brought flowers to the counselor brought flowers to the counseling session after that, and together they put flowers on the grave of this, the mass grave, that not where the client's family was, but just to kind of demystify the experience. So those are some of the examples.
I mean, what I gather is that it actually integrates into everyday life. It's not a kind of lieu de mémoire that come, once a year to like, it's really integrated into everyday life for the survivors and the community.
Yeah, and I think that's why the stakes are so high too, right? Is that that survivors feel ownership over it. They feel dedicated to it. Their loved ones are there. And so this might be a little bit unique than some other places of memorials, where the memorial to your loved ones may be outside of your own community.
So you talk about the ethos of this more the national narrative is reconciliation, because between the Hutu and the Tutsi, they have to live now. They are Rwandans, but how would you describe the gap, and does it create tensions between how people really feel and discuss things in the memorials and how and the national level of memory.
Yeah, so one of the things I think that is used and discussed is that those ethnic categories were created by colonial powers. And that's a central part of history and accurate as well. But I think that that is plays a big role in the national narrative because it then can give people hope that prior to this, they shared the same language, the same food, they experienced interethnic marriages. And that there's a possibility to someday return to that. And I think that's also helpful in looking at who's culpable and who's to blame. And so if you can blame colonial powers or if you can blame the bad government, the previous bad government, that at least makes it so that it's a little bit easier to understand your neighbors who might have engaged in killing, that it wasn't all of their fault, but rather these outside powers of colonial division or the result of bad government. So I found those two aspects to be central in both the national narrative, but also parts of the national narrative that resonated with survivors because it gave them hope that someday their relations could be better. And I talk about this a little bit in my book, and that it might be helpful to think about reconciliation as a process that doesn't end in necessarily social harmony, but that is a series of everyday micro interactions, both on the state level and the communal level, that allow people to slowly get to more of a peaceful coexistence.
So would you say that those memorials and the way they are practiced and the interactions that take place in their proximity, do they promote reconciliation or actually do the opposite because they raise tensions, people are left out, stories are, some stories, as you described, don't get their proper place, traumatized people cannot necessarily be acknowledged as such because they are somehow pushed away a little bit?
Yeah, even with all of those downfalls, I was surprised at how committed survivors were to memorials, that even with all of the problems, they still believed that they served a monumental place in reconciliation and the rebuilding of Rwanda. And so survivors actually talked about these memorials as markers of reconciliation because it showed on the part of the government and the administration that what they experienced was valid, that they were indeed survivors of violence, and that to them meant a lot, actually, even with all of these other challenges that they were very free to tell me about. But I should preface that I didn't interview perpetrators. I didn't interview returned refugees. And I didn't interview the next generation. And so this may be very different for those different social actors.
And I encourage questions, those who have questions, to post them on Q&A because we will move in 10 minutes to the questions part. But I have still some questions I wanted to ask. That you describe this memorial culture and testimony, actually witnessing culture, within a broader toolkit of transitional justice. So can you briefly explain the term, how you understand it, because there are so many ways to understand it, and how does this interact with other components of transitional justice, particularly the legal parts of it?
Yeah, so I imagine transitional justice as these temporary judicial mechanisms that help to take a country from mass atrocity back to more functioning where you can have non-lethal coexistence, so people who aren't killing one another. And what research has shown is that often if you do more than one of these, you can access a greater number of survivors who feel that there's some form of justice. And usually transitional justice can involve restorative justice, which means the focus isn't on punishing the perpetrator, but rather assisting the victim in what they need. But they can also be punitive, which is court cases. So I'll give you a couple examples, like truth and reconciliations commissions. Those are an example of transitional justice. Also courts, both local and national courts. Sometimes grassroots or indigenous practices of justice can be one of them. Lustration, so taking out the entire previous government and replacing them, can be a part of transitional justice. Reparations would be one too, so providing services or healthcare or monetary resources to survivors. And so I think about memorials as working in tandem with truth commissions or courts or places that you could house evidence. And in that way, I think that memorials have done so. I don't think that there was as much of a intentional pairing of memorials with other mechanisms of transitional justice, but we do know that the Gacaca courts, so the local grassroots courts, as well as what happened during the ICTR, the International Tribunal for Rwanda, those did impact the narratives and the information that was shared at memorials. So in that way, they worked together. Memorials also house quite a bit of evidence, and I think that is really key too. And folks that I interviewed also found that that was really central to them, because it was counter to this denialism of the genocide that they were so scared was going to become prominent.
How does can you mentioned the Holocaust? Can you a little bit bring some comparative aspects to this discussion? I think many of our viewers are Holocaust scholars or affiliated to this field. So can you do some comparative work here?
Yeah, well, I think they're both really interesting to compare, in particular about what happens when narratives are told early on. So it was a little bit later when there were public narratives of the Holocaust and survival. And so that's when we started to understand the dynamics of what happened in the camps and what happened in terms of extermination. In Rwanda, the narratives were told much earlier. And so I think it would be interesting to look at how this affects the next generation, because I think about like Aaron Hass's work on thinking about the second generation of Holocaust survivors and how the silence or the trauma of their parents impacted them. There's less silence in Rwanda more generally about narratives of survival, and so that would be really interesting. And I think some of that comes out of I think some of that comes out of this necessity, because you live next to the perpetrator in a way that a lot of Holocaust survivors are not required to live next to their perpetrator. And then I want to touch on as well, for at least thinking about gender-based violence and especially sex slaves. So many women, Tutsi women, were taken as kind of sex slaves during the genocide and then returned back. And they talked about how their family thought that they were culpable that they were having sex with the enemy. But it was really something, it was the only way to live, to survive, because it was out of force. It was not, there was no consent. And I think that discussion is only now really coming up, even in the Holocaust, is when women were exploited by Nazis, or even when women were exploited by other men in the camps. And it's a really difficult topic, but both of those have been neglected, I think, in scholarship all around. So there's a lot of similarities there as well. We also see similarities in that, we see how Holocaust memorials most often, or most definitely, change, and the stories are shaped by whose country is telling that story, right? So the US Holocaust Museum is an excellent example where the US is somehow the heroes in that story. If you go to the US Holocaust Museum, where you would not see that if you went to Yad Vashem. And I think that type of variation is most definitely evident in Rwanda as well, and in Bosnia. And as Cambodia's memorials grow, will likely be there as well.
Maybe one more question on this. How do those issues of the women who were raped, sometimes gave birth to children, the outcome of this rape, how were they perceived back by the community? And are these issues also discussed in the memorials?
They aren't discussed in depth in the memorials, but yeah, so a lot of women gave birth, though some of the women who talked to me said that, that their child was called an enemy, or that they had fraternized with the enemy. And so they really struggled in that sense. Some women didn't experience that and were able to get some social services, because there were support groups for rape survivors and women who experienced rape. But I have to say, a lot of the women who I talked to who sought out those services, they found they would go, 2 towns away to try to remain anonymous. And some of them hadn't even told their husbands about that experience. And so I think it's something that is still discussed, or still an issue. I see it less discussed in Rwanda than I do in other parts of the world, which is interesting. So I've seen some photo exhibits about women who gave birth out of rape, which I have mixed feelings about, but it's interesting that it's talked about in the West a lot more than it's talked about in Rwanda. Mm-hmm. But people are aware of it.
Mm-hmm. Before we open to the questions, one last question about can you talk a little bit about secondary trauma as you define it, and how is it connected to your research?
Yeah, so I guess I would just, for those who might be listening, who are thinking about doing work on the Holocaust, or in doing archival work, or interviewing descendants, or thinking about doing work in genocide and memory more generally, just how difficult it can be for the researcher. I have a lot of students now who are doing work on the aftermath of mass atrocity, and when I was doing the work, there wasn't a lot of resources for researchers, but oftentimes it can be really hard on the researcher. And for me, at least, I know I experienced some secondary trauma, but felt even guilty about experiencing it, because I thought, well, how can I take a break from this research when other people have suffered so much? And so I guess my advice would be to have, those of you who are out there who are thinking about doing this type of research, just remembering how challenging it can be, and ways to take care of yourself in ways that can allow you to do really good research in the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we have a few questions from the audience, and I see they're going in a direction that we actually didn't discuss. So Professor Asher Mateas asked, what and where are the fault lines persisting between the two ethnic groups, vis-a-vis, like in connection to your research?
For fault lines, meaning who perpetrated violence, or?
I mean, how, I guess the question is, you talk about memorials, but how do the perpetrator ethnic group, or what the perpetrators, or those who belong to this group, or as it was called before the end of the so how do they interact with those with the
With
national
memorials?
narrative and the memorials? And
Yeah.
so I mean, those differences, how do they, I think this is, can you talk a little bit about the two groups? And
Yeah, and I want to also just preface this that I do a lot of work with rescuers as well. And so they're a really interesting kind of middle group that are Hutu who saved Tutsi during the genocide. So there was a lot of hope on the part of survivors I interviewed that those who perpetrated violence would then come to memorials and kind of get on the same page. And that memorials could be a place where perpetrators could understand the consequences of their actions, and that there might be, you know, a very formal or maybe not formal, but clear pathway to reconciliation if perpetrators attend the memorial. I wasn't aware, but again, I probably wouldn't have noticed if a perpetrator came because I wasn't an insider in the community. I didn't have anyone that I attended commemorations with say, oh, over there's a perpetrator. I think that happened once, but not in the other times. So I don't know exactly how perpetrators interact, but I imagine that because there were so many civilian perpetrators, some of them are going to the memorial, and there is a re-education process that goes on. And I imagine that those who perpetrated violence, their kids are probably now going to memorials, as this is a huge part of many primary and secondary education. In terms of rescuers, so in terms of those who saved others, when I was there, they were part of a program that was housed at the memorial, one of the memorials that I did my book on. And they would talk to perpetrators and say, listen, there were different choices you could have made. And then they also talked with victims and said, listen, not all Hutu engaged in violence, some people saved. And so they did kind of facilitate some type of interaction in that sense. I hope that answers the question, but I'm happy if I didn't, please retype and let me
okay,
know.
so here's a little long question by Michael Brenner. When I visited Rwanda, it seemed to me that there was a real gap between the official narrative, we are all Rwandans, and an unofficial narrative where everyone still knew that they were either Hutu or Tutsi. I felt that the suppression of the naming of perpetrator and victims collectives was not seen as healthy by everyone. Of course, there are many differences, but imagine that after 1945, there would be a policy to now not distinguish between Nazis and Jews, and the government declared from now on all are Germans. I mean, if we do compare, so it really looks outrageous when we.
Of course. I do want to just challenge a couple things about that actual comparison. So Hutus would not be necessarily Nazis in this comparison, because Nazis were a political group, where Hutus were an ethnic identity at the time, even though that ethnic identity was kind of made up by colonial powers. And the reason why I distinguish this is only because not all Hutu perpetrated violence, and many Hutu were killed during the genocide, many were killed because they were married to a Tutsi, or they saved Tutsis, or they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so I think having those lines can be really problematic, where you just call all Hutu perpetrators. and all Tutsis victims, because there were also Tutsis now that weren't there at the time, but did experience past violence. But I do really your point about how problematic it could be to not discuss ethnicities is a valid one, and I think researchers have really really dived into this, of how problematic it is to not be able to discuss religion or discuss ethnic identity, especially when many people already know one's ethnic identity, because villages and communities are really tight knit. People know each other's families, and because of that, I think that might cause some problems. But it would be different, I think, than saying, like, dissolving the word Nazi. I think that people still talk about them as perpetrators or Hutu hardliners, which would be the political group. But I think that it does pose a challenge. And so participants felt like they had to whisper when they talked to me about ethnicities, and I wasn't allowed to ask about ethnicities. So I think that can be a real challenge when we decide to, instead of talk about something that's complicated, we decide not to talk about it at all. So I think you raise a really important point. The motivation out of it is to try to stop revenge killings and to diminish this idea of us and them, because again, in Rwanda, all the perpetrators and all the victims were still in a very small country together. But important point.
So now I'm asking from Rulinda from Rwanda, and she goes back to what? I guess you know her.
No, I don't know her. I just said it's great to have someone from Rwanda.
Okay, so she said she worked in NGOs and graduate genocide. I served as a graduate genocide survivor association, and she has a lot of experience in those fields and in assisting youth. But she goes back to the point that those who were born and all those who were involved in these raped children who were born out of rape have severe identity problems for them and their parents, and the government does or does not accept them, or the families sometimes fail to accept them, and the parents and the communities. So do you think memory and reconciliation have an impact on this topic?
Absolutely. And this is a really important point. And this is kind of why I keep talking about gender-based violence, is that I think that if there was more discussion about what gender-based violence looks like and is experienced during genocide, then there might be more understanding in terms of this generation of children who were born out of rape. Because that way there would be, if people truly understand that rape is about power and control and public humiliation, then the fault of being born out of rape would be non-existent. People would understand that that was nothing that the child could have done, nothing that the mother could have done, that she did her best to survive and then had this child. And I think if memory was able to illuminate these complicated dynamics of gender-based violence, then we could remember those people in ways that allocated resources and support and understanding to them. So I absolutely think that it has, that memory can do some heavy lifting in making that situation a little bit more bearable for both the children and the mother.
So here are two questions that I'll combine that actually talk about Hutu victims. One about Hutu victims who were like Hutu women that were raped, and if there were, and how does the commemoration and national, I elaborate on national and on local level And on discursive level, do they relate to there's acknowledgement of this? And another question that talks about the victim, Hutu, I mean, I know it's very, very sensitive, but I will still ask, on Hutu victims, or like in Congo, were, and those who experienced violence by the Tutsi before the genocide or after the genocide. So can you say something about that,
Yeah,
on Hutu victims,
absolutely.
if you want?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think that there is a lot of acknowledgement about Hutu women and girls that were raped, or Hutu who were killed, even in acts of rescuing, which I think is a surprise in a lot of ways to me. The part about rescuing, not about the acknowledgement of Hutu women and girls who were raped. So no, that there's a neglected part. And from the Hutu that I experienced who were engaged in rescue, so I don't have experience interviewing Hutu who didn't engage in rescue. They do feel left out, and they do feel left out of national memorials, and a lot of them suffered incredible losses. I mean, their family was killed. They lost a limb trying to save people. Their houses were lost. Their neighbors hate them to this day, because then they were asked to participate in gacaca courts and send their neighbors' kids to jail. They had their cows killed. And so I don't think that suffering of Hutus is acknowledged. And they're really key, obviously, in terms of reconciliation. So that's really important. In terms of also the large scale violence, both in Congo, but I think about also the Kabeho massacre that happened right afterwards. That isn't talked about. And I think that there's ways that you can talk about all of these different human rights violations and in ways that would honor the survivors and the victims of those, but that isn't done so. And I imagine that there are a lot of complicated and hurt feelings from those who have been victimized in that violence, and aren't acknowledged and see the ways that those who were victimized in the genocide were indeed acknowledged. And so again, that comes back to this hierarchy of victimhood that I mentioned early on.
There's still questions pouring in, but I will ask, this will be our last question, and I think it's very interesting. I'll read it. Well-documented studies in this deeply religious country have found churches largely complicit in a genocide by their actions or inactions. How are religions presented in memorial programs, narratives, sites?
Yeah. So the people that I interviewed also had complicated feelings about this. So churches were absolutely complicit in it. Back, there were, parishioners who killed other parishioners. There were priests and pastors who killed their fellow members, and a lot of memorials are now in churches because they were massacre sites. And so that is discussed quite a bit as well in the memorials. What is more complicated is in the aftermath, some survivors said that they felt really forced by their religion to forgive when they weren't quite ready. And that isn't talked about, obviously, because it's a little bit more controversial. But I want to just note that for a lot of people that I interviewed, religion was both an obstacle and a resource in terms of healing after the genocide. And that I also interviewed some priests who slowly started preaching, and the pews were separated, and then one day they started to integrate. So I don't know if that totally answers the question, but it is something, the role of the churches is something that is discussed pretty openly, but the more nuances of the aftermath of religion is less talked about, and the religious landscape in Rwanda is changing quite a bit. And I just want to also note that there's something to be said too with how religion functions in rescue. So Muslims who rescued, and Seventh-day Adventists, and all of these other religious minorities. But I'm happy to talk about that in another session or question.
Okay. Thank you very, very, very much, Nicole. I
Yeah.
know you are recovering for COVID, and thank you for doing all this
Absolutely.
effort.
I'm sorry, my voice got a little hoarse at the end.
I think it was fascinating. There's so much to learn from the Rwanda case, to think with it on other cases, to think this within in mind on other cases. And there are so many questions how to get the moral picture right, but still complex, not to get mixed up between perpetrators and victims, but still not all to conflate them completely with the ethnic groups. And so, I mean, so many important issues.
Yeah, and just one last thing on that is I think it's helpful to think about people's actions rather than as them in social categories. And what I mean by that is that we often think that there's victims, perpetrators, bystanders, and upstanders, right? Those are the four groups, and you're solidly in that group. But actually, oftentimes perpetrators can also be victims, and victims can also be rescuers, and rescuers can also be perpetrators, and they can at some point engage in rescue, and then they can other times decide not to and be a bystander. Or a perpetrator's family can also be victimized, or a perpetrator maybe was told to kill or be killed. And so I think it's a little bit helpful sometimes to think about people's actions rather than them as a single category. And that might help understand some of these complexities.
Yeah. And let me express again, speedy recovery and refuah shlema, be well, alone. So thank you very much, Nicole. It was fascinating, and I really recommend the book, which you can see. And you read it in one, like once you start, you can't leave it out.
And there is a discount code. It's AA217.
Yeah, is it not? Wasn't it on the chat at the first? Anyhow,
I don't think the discount code was, because it just came in. So it's AA217.
Great. Go buy the book. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and bye-bye.